Welcome to New Home Insights, the podcast from John Burns Research Consulting. I'm your host, Dean Worley. If you want to follow market trends, demographics, capital, new ideas, and endeavors that touch on housing, we're going to try to make sense of that every couple of weeks. Let's go. Welcome to the New Home Insights podcast. I'm the host of the show, Dean Worley. It's time to talk about policy, housing policy. We don't do a ton of that here on the show. We've done a little bit of it, but not as much as I'd like to. And I guess we have an election coming up very soon. This is being recorded in the middle of October. It should be airing fairly soon before the election. So that'll be kind of top of mind with a lot of folks. To help us walk through policy, specifically the rental market and the rental world policy, we have David Howard in our virtual studio today. David is the CEO of the National Rental Home Council. That's a nonprofit that is primarily concerned with the single family world, but we're going to talk more about kind of rental in general and rental policy as well. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Really happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. Lots of interesting topics, lots of interesting things to discuss.
There are a ton. I was just telling you how many questions I have, and it's too many. But let's start though with, tell us about how you got to where you are now with the National Rental Home Council, and then maybe a little bit about what you folks do.
So I've been with NRHC now, National Rental Home Council, for about 5.5 years. I came over in the fall of 2019. I was with an organization called the Home Builders Institute, which is really a part of the National Association of Home Builders. And before that, I had a number of related real estate trade association type positions here in DC, always with a policy focus, a development focus. I worked for the Urban Land Institute for a number of years. I worked for the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts for a number of years. And so this was really an opportunity to move forward with work in similar areas to what I had been doing for certainly the majority of my career. The organization obviously is different. Cast of characters is a little bit different. The issues are a little bit different, but generally, this was interesting to me because it was very much a part of the real estate ecosystem of which I had been working in for the past, 20 plus years. So again, been here for about 5.5 years, have certainly seen a lot of changes in the industry during that period of time. I think the rental housing business has gone through quite some change during that period of time as well. And so, every day is different. Every day is exciting. Every day it's a treat to come into work for sure.
You started with the, and I'm going to mess up the acronym, the NRHC, after kind of single family and BTR had become big, but it's become just massively bigger since that time too, hasn't it?
It's interesting, and in terms of just kind of a history lesson, or at least sort of a history lesson from where I sit. Historically in the housing market, there have always been two primary food groups, if you will. There's been the owner-occupied housing market, people purchasing homes, building homes and purchasing homes, and then at the other end of the spectrum, there has been multifamily, apartment living. And then in between, there's always kind of been this gray area of everything else. And that's really where single-family rental housing has lived, excuse the pun. The business of single-family rental housing has been around forever, certainly for decades. But it's really only been over the past, say, 10 to 12 years that the market has really come into its own. It's defined itself. It's really starting to take shape as a separate and distinct asset class within the housing ecosystem. And so that's one of the things that has been really, really interesting for me to observe and for me to be a part of.
And that more or less corresponds, timing-wise, with the institutional investors becoming a big part of the SFR. Not as big a part as a lot of people seem to think, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But let's start big picture. So we're going to start with kind of national policy, which I know you guys are a national group. You're based in D.C. We'll talk then about some state and local policy initiatives and what's going on there in the rental world. Then a little bit about rent control specifically, since it's such a hot topic. And then we'll end up talking about affordability, supply, and maybe a tease on insurance, also a very, very major hot topic right now. But let's start really big picture. I know there's some national legislation, or at least some movements to get some national legislation that could impact these larger entities that have become a somewhat, but not as important a part of the single family world as we think. Give us a little background on what's going on there and what's your take on that.
I think I would start by saying clearly housing has come to the forefront of much of policy conversation here in Washington, D.C., which candidly is a little bit of a change from what we've seen in the past. Housing is so core to the American economy. It's always been surprising to me that it hasn't taken more of a role in terms of capturing the attention of policymakers here in Washington, D.C., both on the left and the right. That has certainly changed over the last 4, 5, 6 years. A lot of that coincided with what was happening in 2022, 23, into 2024 with COVID. Obviously, that brought a lot of renewed and even new attention to the role of housing and rental housing in particular, both single family in our case and multifamily as well. And so we have seen some pieces of legislation introduced here in Washington, D.C. at a federal level that seeks to address concerns that certain policymakers might have as it relates to housing, rental housing, and then single family rental housing in particular. And we've been spending a lot of time working on those bills. We've been spending a lot of time working with the policymakers, staffers who are behind those particular pieces of legislation. I think it's fair for policymakers to be concerned about housing. I think it's very appropriate for policymakers here in Washington, D.C. to look at issues of housing supply, housing affordability, housing accessibility. And there are lots and lots of bills that have been introduced over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years that seek to influence all of those areas within the housing ecosystem. And frankly, I think single family rental housing and the legislation and regulation we have seen that impacts single family rental housing is really just a part of that. It's an attempt on the part of policymakers to shape the way the housing market will be available and accessible to consumers moving forward.
Can you give us a little taste, though, of what is the nuts and bolts of some of this legislation that I understand has been brought forward to maybe curtail the role or the size of institutional parties in SFR?
There is a bill that would seek to, there are a couple of bills that would seek to limit the extent to which housing providers can purchase and in some cases build single family rental housing. Again, we are actively involved with those bills. I will say those pieces of legislation have been circulating around Washington, D.C. probably for 2 or 3 years now. And so these aren't new efforts to address concerns about rental housing. These are efforts that have been present for a period of time. And some of this really is about policymakers attempting to understand more fully what single family rental housing really is. And so we spend a lot of time obviously pushing back on what we view as legislation that would be harmful to single family rental housing. But we also spend a lot of time trying to educate policymakers about the market and about the ways that legislation impacting the single family rental housing market impact or affects the ultimate end user, renters, their families, and the communities where those homes are owned and built.
Is the impetus of this is it kind of a fear that that big is bad, or is it a fear that the SFR, when those folks are buying up SFR, they're sort of taking it out of the pool available to homeowners and shifting it to the rental pool? Is that the motivations?
I think there's a broad-based acceptance amongst policymakers, both in Washington, D.C. and in states across the country, that the real underlying problem with housing today is supply. I do believe that that is largely unquestioned by policymakers. And I also believe what's happening in terms of legislation that has been introduced that targets single family rental housing is an attempt to address legitimate concerns that policymakers have around housing supply. Now, the attempt to regulate or restrict the ownership of single family rental homes as a way to increase supply is, we believe, not an appropriate path forward. It's not a way to address the underlying problem, which is there not only is not enough supply, there's not enough investment coming into existing housing to take care of things like renovations and rehabilitations and improving the stock of housing that we currently have. And that's really the role of providers of single family rental homes, especially the larger providers, the so-called institutional investors in this space. What the larger providers of single family rental homes have really learned to do well is bring investment capital into the housing market to improve that market, to, again, conduct repairs, renovations, rehabilitations. We have to remember the average home in this country is nearly 40 years old. We know from data that we have, our large member companies invest on average over $30,000 in each home that they purchase, in new appliances, landscaping, things that make those properties better places to live. The average home buyer, if you or I were to go out and purchase a home, the average amount of money based on data that we would put into that home is about $7,000. And so you can see there's a huge variation in the amount of investment that flows into existing homes by single family rental home providers as opposed to individuals like you or me.
So Lowe's and Home Depot are big fans of SFR.
That's right. And we have very strong relationships with both of those companies and companies like them.
Yeah. Now, isn't there also in some quarters a little bit of antagonism even towards build to rent, which seems odd because that is by definition adding a unit of housing to the supply that we all agree we need?
Build to rent is a home run for the housing market. And you're absolutely right. Any attempt to limit the amount of home building that provides more single family rental housing is almost completely misguided. Again, the problem is housing supply. And when we say that the problem is housing supply, we're not just talking about owner-occupied housing, for sale housing. We're talking about the fact that there is a supply deficit across the housing landscape, whether it's for sale, single family housing, whether it's multifamily housing, or in our case, single family rental housing. There isn't enough housing of all types. And build to rent is a very innovative and exciting way to bring new single family rental housing online.
Is there, though? Isn't there a little bit of political antagonism towards BTR?
There's a little bit. To the extent that there are misperceptions about what build to rent is. I will tell you, in most of the bills that are out there that seek to regulate the single family rental housing industry, build to rent is exempt. So we are seeing a lot of that. And again, that gets back to my earlier comments that most policymakers understand what the real problem is, which is we just don't have enough housing. And so when they're crafting legislation that perhaps takes aim at this industry, they are exempting new home building of single family rental housing.
Let's be fair to all sides here and just pose the question that are there downsides to institutional investors in the SFR world? Or do those groups tend to, I don't know, increase their rents more aggressively than the mom and pops? Is that a concern with some of these folks who are trying to maybe, bound these institutional folks?
So in terms of context, institutions, again, a word that I try not to use in terms of this market, but I'll use large providers. Large providers own about 600,000 homes across this country. And that's a number that comes from the Urban Institute. That's not NRHC data. That's independent, objective data from the Urban Institute. 600,000 homes might sound like a lot, but it comes out to 0.4% of the housing in the United States, which means if you back it out, 99.6% of the housing in the United States is owned by someone other than a large provider of single-family rental housing. And so when we talk about things like increasing rents, there's no company that is anywhere near large enough in any market to influence rents, to set their own rents. And so when we talk about the fact that the market is the ultimate arbiter of rents, that's backed up in the data.
Yeah, it depends on how you define it. I know when we define it, sometimes we'll look at investors or groups with 100 units or more, which isn't all that big. But even if you define it in that loose of a way, that's still about 2 or 3% of the SFR inventory out there is owned by these semi-large groups. The next bucket, by the way, is folks who own something like 50 or 100, but the by far 90+% is literally mom and pops with ones and twos.
That's right. There are about 20 million single-family rental homes in the United States, which includes single-family detached homes, townhomes, duplexes, that sort of thing. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. 90+% of those single-family rental homes are owned by individuals, the so-called mom and pops, and small local businesses.
Is there still, though, a perception out there? Because every once in a while, you'll see like something in the media. It probably is on TikTok or something like that, where like some institutional investors have gobbled up a larger share of a specific area for a specific time period. And you see that sometimes in the media. So is there a misperception about the market depth of these larger investors?
I think there is a misperception. And I would say there's a misperception, and there's also a lot of that is attributable to the fact that it's hard to peel back the underlying data. Oftentimes, when we hear that a company owns 20 homes in a particular neighborhood, there could be very good, legitimate reasons why there's a need for an owner to purchase 20 homes in a neighborhood. What we find with the larger providers of single-family rental homes, the institutions, is they are very good at providing housing, single-family rental housing, where it is needed the most. They're providing housing near places of employment, near modes of transportation, in quality school districts. They're providing housing in places where people want to live. And so when we hear, again, that there is critical mass of homes in a certain market or a certain MSA that are owned by larger providers, again, there are often very good reasons why there are larger concentrations of homes owned by larger providers in those cities. It's just a question of, can you peel it back and figure out what those reasons are?
Okay, here's a big question, and I know you want to be as tactful as you possibly can, and you're going to be. But I just want to kind of get your take. We have this election coming up. Do you have can you give us sort of a little bit of a rundown of the two different major candidates and what the policies that they've talked about that would most impact you and how you folks look at that?
Well, it's certainly, that's certainly the question making the rounds of Washington, D.C. housing policy circles. This is a really exciting time. I hate to refer to this as the most important election season in history because we hear that every 4 years, even every 2 years. We're going to have a new president in 3 weeks. Yeah. We could very likely have a new Senate and a new House in 3 weeks as well. And so obviously new members of Congress, new members of the administration bring a lot of important change to all sectors of the economy. Housing, being that it's so important, will be impacted and will be affected. I will say, to get to your question, in terms of the presidential race, both candidates have, I think, addressed, again, the underlying core issues of what is challenging and what is facing the housing market, which is supply and affordability, both of which obviously are related. The vice president, I think, has spoken very eloquently about the need to build more housing and the need for policy to incentivize and promote new housing. I think the former president has also spoken about ways to bring new housing online, using federal lands, opening up federal lands for new housing development. There are many, many markets. Obviously, you and your colleagues at John Burns know this better than I. There are many, many markets that are land constrained in this country. And I think that obviously has an impact on the ability for home builders to do what they do best, which is build new housing. And so, again, I think the former president has identified that as an important opportunity to bring new supply online. So both candidates have spoken about, again, the core issue of what is holding housing back, which is supply. We can quibble about specific policies, specific sound bites. Obviously, we're not going to agree with everything that both candidates propose or discuss in terms of housing, but to the extent that the new president, whoever it might be, can be successful in encouraging and, again, incentivizing new housing development and new housing investment, I think that's a win for everyone, and that's what we're hoping to see. And we're involved in some of those conversations here in D.C. with both campaigns and, again, members in the Senate and members in the House.
It does seem like on the Democratic side, there has been a little bit of a finding of religion on housing supply in the last few years. So that's a good way to segue into talking about state policies and local policies, is that in California, here where I'm based, where Governor Gavin Newsom has been pretty aggressively pro-housing, and there's been some legislation that's passed that has actually at least sought to increase supply in housing and take some of that power away from localities. So let's talk about state and local. And you and I talked before this, and you talked about how there's kind of sort of a couple of buckets in terms of when you look at state policies and maybe even local policies. There's some existential threats that actually literally threaten housing supply and kind of a gut level. And there's a little more kind of the normal stuff, for lack of a better term, like rent caps and things like that. Let's talk about the first. What's going on in the states that you would look at as an existential threat? Are there states that are just looking to have policies that could just really constrain supply dramatically?
Yeah, first I would start by saying the real action in the housing market is at the hyper-local level. That's really where housing development and housing investment takes place. Why? Because all real estate is local and people live local. Very obvious statement. And that, by the way, is one of the challenges with developing and passing legislation that impacts housing, that drives new housing supply. The further away you are from the markets where housing takes place, the less ability you really have to drive change in this market. So, for example, it's really difficult for federal policymakers to enact legislation that will have an assured impact on housing development. It's really difficult for state policymakers to enact legislation that will impact housing on the ground. That's very much a local business. That's not to say that federal policymakers and state policymakers cannot have an impact. They certainly can. But where the real action is, again, is at the local level, because that's where the zoning decisions take place. That's where the approvals are passed or not passed. That's where the real decisions are made to allow new housing development and investment to move forward. And so we are seeing legislation at the state level in certain states, we are seeing legislation and regulation at the local level, the city level, the county level in certain states. Some states are more active, and I suspect you and your listeners can guess what those states are. The Californias, the Colorados, the Minnesotas, those kinds of states tend to be more active in enacting housing-related policy that impact both us and our colleagues in the home building space and in the multifamily space. And so last year, for example, we saw a number of bills in California that were introduced that attempted to regulate the ability of large providers of single-family rental homes to provide single-family rental housing. Interestingly, there was a bill in California that also would have really hamstrung home builders from building new homes for rent, which again is really, in my view, and I think in most people's view, a real problem in terms of thinking about what's holding housing back, which is there's just not enough of it, as I've talked about before.
It strikes me, is some of that maybe from sort of a stigma about renters, you think, as opposed to homeowners?
I think that's very much the case. I think it's very much the case. We've seen situations in places like Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas and Texas where there either has been legislation or attempts to create legislation that would have a negative impact on our business. But really, when you study the legislation and get to what's behind the legislation, it really comes down to a problem that policymakers have with so-called renters in their district. And this is not new. We've seen this. You've seen this for 50 years in this country. We want people in our community who are going to own homes, who are going to invest in their communities, who are going to live and work and educate their kids in our communities. The reality is renters do the exact same thing. And so that's very much a part of our policy and advocacy strategy at the state level and the local level, talking about the value that renters bring to communities. I was in Georgia last week at a property tour that we organized with one of our build-to-rent developer members, and they told me, and this is a community right outside of Atlanta, on average, their residents stay 4+ years in their homes. The average homeowner stays in their home, I think it's 7 years or something right around there. So you have a situation, now this is a build-to-rent product, but again, the fact that you have usually it's a family staying in a home for up to 4 years really dispels and runs counter to a lot of those myths that are out there about renters and how attached they really are to their communities.
And you can say the same about the demographics as well. I've said this on the show before, we've brought it up, but I'll say it again, is that we have a lot of clients in the SFR world and, of course, the BTR world, and they know their demographics, and their renters, their users, let's call them, are indistinguishable demographic, income, all those other demographic aspects from those homeowners right across the street or in the same master plan or what have you.
That's right. And one of the other things that we spend a lot of time talking about and developing data and research around is the fact that the number one reason why a resident in a single family rental home does not renew their lease is because they've purchased a home. They've become a homeowner. We know that a lot of families or residents in single family rental homes are there because they know they want to own a home. They know they're going to become homeowners. They're just not ready right now. But they also don't want to be in an apartment in downtown Charlotte or Dallas or pick a city. Yeah. They want to be in a home. They want to have a yard. They want to have a garage. They want to have an extra bedroom. They want to have a home office, what have you. They want to be near a dog park. And so we very much look at single family rental housing as a rung on the ladder toward home ownership. And many of our member companies, to their credit, have programs in place that are designed to assist residents who are on that path to home ownership. Things like on-time rent payment services. So when you pay your rent on time, the companies will report that to the credit bureaus so that your credit profile is at a better place when you go to apply for a mortgage.
Okay.
Some of our members have down payment assistance programs, first look programs. Many offer rent-to-own programs. So there's a lot happening in this industry, in the single-family rental housing market, that has a close connection to home ownership. And I think that's a really important point.
David, can we talk a little bit about the sort of the nuts and bolts, the actual logistics of some of this legislation that threatens BTR? What are they actually proposing?
So local policymakers, local decision makers really have an ability to impact whether or not new housing development moves forward through the zoning process, through the approval process. We have seen in several situations in Georgia, counties, in some cases municipalities, that have introduced moratoria on new home building to the extent that those communities, those new homes, are going to be held for rent. They're going to be single family rental homes instead of homes that are made available for purchase. And we really haven't seen the extent of that kind of activity in other states. It's really something that we're seeing in Georgia much more than we're seeing elsewhere. And part of it is Georgia, especially the counties and the cities and towns in and around Atlanta, have been magnets for population growth, job growth, companies relocating to Atlanta, expanding in the market. And I think to some extent, local policymakers are really just trying to get their hands around the best ways to accommodate this growth. Okay. In many ways, the Georgia housing market, again, Atlanta in particular, is very much a success story. A lot of really good home building has taken place in Atlanta, continues to take place in and around Atlanta. And build to rent, we have to remember the business of building a single family home for rent has been around forever. Mm-hmm. What's new about build to rent is the building of entire communities or large sections of master planned communities, for example, where the homes are for rent. And for a lot of people who are responsible for approving projects, giving projects the green light, build to rent is just very, very new. And so again, a lot of policymakers in local markets just don't understand build to rent. They don't get it. Is it multifamily? Is it single family? Do the homes ever sell to owner occupants? What does this look like 10 years from now? How are the homes constructed? What is the quality? So we hear all of these questions anytime there is some kind of an issue with a build to rent approval or zoning issue. And again, it just, to some extent, it's imperative that we have those conversations with local decision makers and policymakers about what build to rent is and what the benefits of it are to those communities.
The concern particularly about sort of the upkeep, like, hey, will it get run down in 10 years? That seems particularly misguided to me, because that institutional, that build to rent developer is obviously invested in maintaining their rents. So they're going to want to maintain the upkeep of that community more so than even a mom and pop might.
You would expect to hear this from me, but I will tell you, build to rent developments and communities are indistinguishable from new home for sale developments. Again, I mentioned the development I toured last week outside of Atlanta. I would live in one of those homes in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. Granite countertops, wood flooring, the latest appliances. A lot of these homes also are bringing in are really, a lot of the developers are committing to sustainable design, sustainable development. And so you're seeing things like solar panels on many of the roofs, Energy Star appliances. I mean, this is not your single family rental home from
Yeah.
50, 60, 70 years ago. I mean, these are very nice homes, quality built in really nice communities with clubs and pools and pickleball courts and
Yeah.
walking paths and dog parks and the whole thing. I mean, they really are something. And one of the things that one of the things that we have realized that helps to tell the build to rent story is organizing opportunities for local policymakers, state level policymakers, to come out and tour projects. We organized a tour out of a project outside of Sacramento. We organized a tour outside of Atlanta a few weeks ago. When we can get members of the city council, county commission, state houses, governor's offices, when we can get those folks to the projects, to walk the grounds and walk the homes, and most importantly, to meet the residents, it's like a light goes off in their minds when they can be there, when they can see it, when they can talk to the developer. You can see something change,
Yeah.
and it's really something to behold.
Now,
Because
gonna be
they're very, very well built homes and very nicely constructed communities.
Now, there's going to be bad tenants. There's also going to sometimes some, not great property managers or owners of SFR. Do you guys ever work with localities to have legislation to help sort of, I don't know, clean up your own house or work to make sensible laws along that regard?
We do. Not all of our work involves pushing back on
Okay.
legislation that we think is harmful to the industry. We're very proactive. We spend a lot of time working with policymakers on ideas to improve the resident experience, to improve the rental housing experience. There was a bill in California that passed this session that would require property owners, rental housing property owners of a certain size, to report on-time rent payments, and that's something that we support. And we worked with the sponsor of the bill. We worked with co-sponsors of the bill. And we thought that was an important thing. We had a bill passed this year that in Georgia, that would allow rental housing property owners to respond effectively to the squatter issue in Georgia.
Yeah, okay.
There was a lot happening with squatters in and around Atlanta. There was very little that property owners could do about it. There was very little that law enforcement could do about it. Very little the courts could do about it.
Yeah.
And we worked with policymakers to craft. We actually wrote the bill that ultimately passed in Georgia that created rules of the road around how you could remove squatters from your property. And the bill was unanimously supported, both Republicans and Democrats in the House, and unanimously supported Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, and the governor signed it first chance he had.
That's something legislatively that it seems like it's a no-brainer on a national level too, because you do see reports. It's crazy how the laws about squatting are kind of toothless, and it's just nuts to me that it's not a slam dunk kind of legislation. But it strikes me though that you can kind of almost challenge long-term political orthodoxies in that the more localized, the more power on housing policy resides locally, kind of the more likely you're going to get dampeners on supply and kind of vice versa. Because you tend to see on the local, like I think you said it a minute ago, the local level is where you see the kind of, okay, that's kind of a crazy restriction on housing.
That's very true. And the reality is, when we talk about the fact that there is a serious undersupply of housing in this country, that undersupply extends to virtually every market in the country. And so we're talking about counties and cities in California, counties and cities in Texas, counties and cities in Massachusetts and Illinois. It's everywhere. And so local policymakers all across this country are dealing with the same issues, which have to do with the fact that they need more housing.
Have you been encouraged by places in California? Again, it seems a little bit counterintuitive, but you had SB 330 here, which kind of added a thing called builder's remedy. Essentially, if a city is not in compliance with affordable housing requirements, the builder can kind of have a just tremendous leverage to be able to develop on a piece of land over the protest of that city. Is there other legislation going on that's encouraging along those lines?
So it's interesting. We're at a point now in mid-October of 2024 where a lot of legislatures, to include California, are looking forward to 2025. And so we're having a lot of conversations with elected officials across the country. Some of that obviously is more serious than it is in other places, because in a lot of places we don't know what the results of the elections are going to be. It seems like every elected official in this country at whatever level is up for reelection, and that's not entirely true, but it seems that way. And so it's really difficult to have substantive conversations at this point until we know what the ultimate makeup of the legislatures are going to be post November the 5th. Now we know in California which way the state legislature is going to break. It's going to be heavily Democrat. We know what the makeup of the legislatures are going to be in other states. And so we can have certain conversations knowing where we're going to be on November the 6th. And so that's helpful. And I will say, even in places like California, that have reputations for being more heavily regulated, again, this recognition that housing supply is the real problem and it has an impact on housing affordability really resonates. And elected officials, for the most part, understand that. And again, we have a number of bills that we were working last session, or I guess I should say in California, this current session, because the session's still ongoing.
Yeah.
And had a lot of really constructive conversations and got to a really good place with a lot of legislators that I think will benefit us moving forward.
It does seem like there's been a bit of a sea change. Again, as I mentioned a minute ago, I think just about everyone across the political spectrum has grown to realize we do need more supply, and we need to stop doing things that get in the way of supply. Other than, is the most obvious thing, though, is just let's make it easier. Let's not have 7 years from concept to entitlement or longer. That's the rough average in California. Is that still the most important thing policymakers can do?
I think it is. And one anecdote there, we had an event that we hosted in Phoenix. We have a state chapter in Arizona. We had a breakfast event a couple of months ago, and we invited an elected official, a very prominent elected official, to come down and talk to the group. And he happens to be a home builder as well, and has been a home builder in Arizona for 20 years. And he said 10 years ago, you could entitle a piece of land for a new home development and break ground within 6 months. Now, that process takes 4 years. And so people think, well, okay, you went from 6 months to 4 years. That's a real bummer because now it just takes longer. It's not just that it takes longer to build housing. When the time period to build, to entitle and build, and ultimately move people into those homes extends, the price of housing extends.
Yeah.
Time and cost are inextricably linked in the world of housing development. And so I understand that there need to be reviews, there need to be approvals, there needs to be local buy-in. I think everybody gets that and understands that. But you just can't go from a world where you could entitle and build in 6 months to a world where now that same process takes 4 years and not expect it to have huge impact on the price of housing. And partly that's what we're seeing. You all know this better than anybody. The price of housing not only is driven by supply and demand, but it's driven by the price of land. And I'm hearing that more and more. The price of labor, the price of materials.
Oh, yeah. It makes sense to have a discussion on, okay, where are we going to say it's okay to build? Do we have the resources to support that building when it's done? But other than that, once you've made that decision, once you have that blueprint, kind of get out of the way. Would alleviate a lot of these issues. Certainly with respect to the time, I get it. But I agree with you. You do want the local buy-in. But once you have that, it should be a fairly straightforward process, and so often it's not. Now, let's talk a little bit about rent control. I know California recently also, not to just harp on California, I'll ask you if other folks are doing things like rent control. But had a rent control bill passed not that long ago, and it's relatively innocuous. It exempts properties for the first 20 years, and then it's like, I think it's inflation plus 5%, something like that. Do you consider that something, okay, we don't love it, but we can live with it, or do you see kind of a slippery slope for any kind of rent control?
I see a slippery slope, and that's the concern. I mean, first of all, my concern is with the motivation. It's the why. It's knowing that we have such a problem with housing supply, knowing that we are so undersupplied, and that there's not housing out there today for people who need it. And by the way, for people who can afford to pay for it.
Yeah.
The fact that there just isn't enough of all type of housing, that's the core issue that we should be focused on almost exclusively and entirely. And to see us deviate from that conversation, and look, there are a lot of ways to skin that cat. I might not agree with your proposals to increase housing supply, but at the end of the day, if you're proposing something and it ultimately passes and it ends up producing new units of housing, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
There is some question as to how we get there, but though we might not agree, we're heading in the same direction.
Yeah.
Rent control and policies like it. I mean, first of all, I think there is a real economic problem that has been, I think, widely reported on. There's been a lot of really good research on how rent control is a disincentive, and in a lot of places, in a lot of cases, a big disincentive to new housing development and ongoing investment. And so I think there's a real problem there in terms of understanding the impact that rent control really has. But again, my other problem with rent control, whether it's in California or elsewhere, is the fact that it's a terrible distraction from the real challenge that we're facing as an industry, and that so many housing consumers are facing. I think people who want housing. And again, there's a lot that goes into building new housing and investing in new housing. But I think we've got to be true to the people who need housing in this country, whether it's because they're able to purchase it or because they want to rent it. And spending millions and millions of dollars and lots of time and resources on things like rent control, which ultimately serve as a disincentive for new development and new investment, just takes us to a place where we shouldn't go.
I agree and disagree with that. Just personally, I think one of the issues is, can people get housing that they can afford, and rent control does speak to that. And I think if you craft something that is, I don't think the California bill has cost one single multifamily permit. I don't think it's not likely to, but I would absolutely agree. You can slippery slope your way down to something like right now, California has a thing called Proposition 33, which would be a very undesirable impact on housing, I think. Or St. Paul recently instituted a very severe, I think it was like 3%, and multifamily permits plummeted overnight. So I think you can, but I don't think it necessarily does. But that's just my take.
Well, and again, I think we can agree to disagree. But if you look at some of the underlying facts, and I know there's a lot happening in California, a lot going on in the market, and it's a market you know well. But you have to ask yourself the question: why is the median home price in California $650,000, $700,000, which is orders of magnitude higher than the median home prices of most other states? Is it because there's rent control, or does that at least play a part? I think that's open for debate.
I think it's more like what we were talking about a minute ago, which is the process, the entitlement process, and the antagonism toward any kind of development is so extraordinary in a lot of places within California that it adds dollars every year. They stifle it. They're adding dollars to that home price. Let's talk about supply a little bit, and then and end on that. What I asked a minute ago, like, what can we do other than speed the process, or is speeding the process one of the most important things to do about opening up supply? And I think you agreed. Is there anything else? Are there any other mechanisms that would just really juice supply in any meaningful way?
I think there's some things that can be done. I think there are. I think there are interesting things that are being done in Ohio, for example. The state put a lot of money. I think I could have this wrong, but I think it's $100 million behind a grant program for local communities that expedite the housing approval process. And so, if you're a local town, a local municipality in the state of Ohio, and you're changing your zoning and approval process to speed the process of bringing new housing online, you'll get a grant from the state for that. And we've seen some so far. It's early, but we've seen a very positive response to that. I think if you look at Florida, Florida passed what I thought was a very strong bill, the Live Local Act, last year that cut away a lot of red tape, cut away a lot of bureaucracy, but still maintained the integrity of the review process, but has led to, and you all probably have data on this, has led to the development and construction of an awful lot of new units of housing, both for sale housing and, importantly, multifamily rental housing. And so I think there are things under discussion and consideration in some other places to provide capital to local community banks for the purpose of supporting new housing development. So I think there are a lot of really interesting ideas and proposals out there that largely are happening at the state and the local level that can serve to bring new housing online.
It's interesting. I found that interesting that you said about the bringing some resources to these folks. We have a lot of builder clients, and very often I hear, "Hey, we don't think that City X is dragging its feet. They're just grossly understaffed, and they're doing their best, but they can't get someone out there. They can't do permit check, things like that. It adds months and months. That's not going to get to the heart of it, because the years and years is from antagonism towards development. But at least it can make it 6 months faster or something like that if they had more resources."
That's right. And we're hearing that from our members as well, that part of the difficulty with getting projects reviewed and or approved is the fact that it just takes so long, and it's a staffing issue.
Yeah. You mentioned Florida a minute ago. I have two more questions. One, the two more end questions here. One is insurance. So Florida is having a major insurance crisis right now. How does that affect your world in the rental world, and how so?
It affects our world in a couple of ways. First of all, when property insurance becomes more expensive, it becomes more difficult for owners and providers of single-family rental homes to afford to operate those properties. It just becomes more expensive. And so you can say, well, you can pass that on to the resident. And in some cases that happens, either in full or in part, but that's always a tricky business. Secondly, I will tell you that with the cost of insurance increasing like it is, especially in places like Florida and California, it makes purchasing housing much more expensive. And so I think a lot of potential home buyers are reassessing their situation and running the calculus through 4 or 5 times and realizing it's just become much more difficult to afford to buy a home. Not just because mortgage rates are 5-6+%, but also because you're now paying 50% more in insurance than you were 3 years ago. And that's if you can even get insurance. There are a lot of jurisdictions now where you can't even get insurance on homes because of the potential for fires and floods and things like that.
Not just hurricanes in Florida, it's fires in California and extreme weather in anywhere, potentially, especially in the Southeast, which is ironically, of course, the locus of so much growth in the country. So, I mean, do you feel like we're going to talk about insurance for a very long time? And is that an area where it almost cries out for a national solution of some sort?
To some extent, I think it does. I mean, and there are precedents. If you look at the National Flood Insurance Program, I know there have been discussions around something similar for property insurance. I don't know if we would ever get there. I know there's some issues with the flood insurance program, but I think it's certainly a topic for conversation, and I think it is something that policymakers here at the federal level are discussing.
Last question on supply, really kind of, is that one of the problems with supply in the multifamily world is capital and the access to capital and affordable capital. Do you see anything, are you tracking that? Do you see anything happening in that? Do you have any take on what the Fed is going to do next? Anything like that?
Well, I can tell you that the cost of capital has really had an impact on the ability of single-family rental home owners to expand their portfolios, particularly the larger companies. What we're seeing in the single-family rental home space is a fairly precipitous drop-off over the past few years in acquisition activity. Larger owners are buying many fewer properties. The way that they're growing and expanding largely has to do with build to rent. We have seen a major transition from the purchasing of homes to the building of homes. A lot of that has to do with the cost of capital. A lot of that has to do with some of the issues we've discussed, namely supply. There are just fewer homes available. The homes that are available are much more expensive. And so in a lot of cases, it's easier and more economical for providers of single-family rental homes and single-family rental home communities to just build. And so that's what we're seeing. And I think some of that, again, is attributable to what you mentioned, which is the cost of capital is just much more onerous than it was 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Yeah. One more quick surprise question. Who's going to win the election? Just
if
kidding.
I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I wouldn't be having, this has been a great conversation, but I wouldn't be having this conversation with you.
You're having some audio difficulties. What did you say, Dean? I can't, I just want to see the look in your eyes.
What I can tell you is it's very close.
Yeah, it's a coin flip for sure. David, thank you so much for coming on. I learned a ton. I say this a lot, but it's true. I always come on these things and I learn a ton. That's part of the reason I love hosting this podcast.
Well, thank you to you. Great conversation. We do a lot of work with John Burns. You all do terrific work. This is a little bit of a commercial for you guys. So I really respect you and John and the whole team over there. And a lot of we talk about policy and things that are meant to impact the single-family rental housing industry. A lot of this is about transparency. A lot of this is about getting the data out there, getting the information out there, and we try to do that. But you all do just a superb job of that, and so I want to recognize you and the team there for all your efforts there. We need to tell this story better and more effectively, and a lot of that is producing good quality data, getting it into the hands of people who can make a decision with it.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. That's always good to hear. This has been Dean Worley at the New Home Insights podcast. We will see you again. We'll see you again right after the election.